because we've got a lot of young people here.
Yes, I noticed. That's great.
Tell us, when did you realize that you had leadership qualities or that you wanted to be a leader in some way? Do you think back to when you first realized this?
Well, I don't know that it was probably when I was a leader or when I was elected a leader, when I realized I had the responsibility and the duty of a leader. But very frankly, I had, as a child and even as a young woman, had practiced leadership, just didn't recognize it as leadership at that time. I remember, as I'm the oldest of 10, and my mother always imposed upon me that I was to set the example for my brothers and sisters, and so consequently I had the responsibility, which is what leadership's about. It's about responsibility and duty. And so taking care of the others and setting the example for them was sort of thrust on me, and the responsibility she placed on me. And then later on, as a young woman, when I was looking for an opportunity kind of to figure out how we as women could participate in the civic involvement in our community. The Chicana movement was going on, and certainly it was being managed and operated by the men in the community, and women had very little say. The Latinas and Chicanas had very little say. So we started getting together with one another as women, and eventually I came across a whole group of, I'll call them older Chicanas. I was in my 20s and they were in their 40s. And at that time, we decided to put together an organization that we thought we needed to come together as a group of women who were like-minded and start talking about these issues. And of course, that was the feminist movement at that time, and there was a lot of that going on throughout the communities and throughout the country. But in particular, I don't know how, eventually all of them said to me, you need to be the president of the organization. And I had been involved in organizing for a number of years in the community that I guess led to that kind of following, and eventually. So then I realized, but again, I always took that leadership responsibility as a leadership of duty and responsibility. Now I have to do this, and I have to organize this, and I have to do these kinds of things. So I don't know that I really recognized my leadership at that point, but I was leading. I was doing this work. When I was organizing, I was leading and doing the kinds of things. So eventually it became a capital L, I guess, where it became more of a leadership responsibility. But it is interesting that even as a kid and as a young woman, all of these kinds of opportunities eventually led to having the kind of leadership duties and responsibilities that I have today, and having very serious responsibilities and duties to the issue of leadership, which is a very critically important part of what we do every single day. And again, collectively, we're all leaders in different ways. And some of us are as elected leaders, but basically we play a leadership role. It's how we use our leadership skill set. But it is something that probably in my mid-20s, somewhere along the way, there was a thrust to leader. I don't know that I felt it necessarily until I was probably elected, and even then it was still quite a duty then.
So in a sense, it was reflected back to you.
Absolutely.
And how people were seeing you.
Exactly, how they were seeing me.
In contrast, when you were a young person, were you mindful that there might be impediments to you as a Latina achieving a leadership position, or did you never have that feeling?
Oh no, very much so. I mean, growing up in a very traditional Mexican-American household, and with the kind of society that we have, absolutely there were limits. In fact, there was no idea that we would achieve leadership. Even though as we were practicing these skill sets and within our family, within our own community, within our environment, at that time there was an absolute barrier, not only as a woman, but as in the Latino community, because there was so much discrimination and so much sexism. So the idea is that we ourselves felt very limited. And so that was the existence in our community. I mean, when I was part of the Chicana movement, we were part of fighting the inequality in our community, and education and opportunity and all that was going on. And so we were fighting the issues of discrimination. And so we knew there were limits, and we wanted to push through those limits, even though at the time, we really knew it was almost an unbelievable thing to try and overcome. We looked at almost that kind of inequity as part and parcel of things that we're never going to change. Where you're a young person, you're so impatient that you just don't think it's going to change, even though we were part of battling it every single day. And that was also true of sexism at that time. When we knew that the men were going to treat us in a way that they were going to limit our opportunities, that's the way it was in the community. Even though we were battling it and we disliked it and we were going to challenge it, at that time we had our own limitations. That's what I grew up with, and as a young woman, that is a limitation that existed within the community. Even though I personally, I personally did not allow that to limit me. I always felt there was an opportunity to do better and to get stronger, to do all those kinds of things. It's not like it discouraged me, so I stood back. Instead, I did move forward. But at the same time, our society, way back in the early 70s, there was tremendous discrimination against Mexicanos and Latinos, and of course, against women as well. And so those were barriers and obstacles that we had to overcome. And so we didn't really see ourselves in those leadership roles at all. We wanted to think about ourselves in that way, in that, we're going to get Latinos and Latinas elected, we're going to go into professional positions. There was some smattering of that here and there. But in trying to achieve that kind of equality, at that time it was something we were fighting towards, but we didn't think we'd get there. And in the same way about women. Those two were extensive barriers. Now today we're going to potentially see the first woman elected to the president of this country. So in my lifetime I have seen dramatic change, but I must tell you that the discrimination and the limitations as a young woman were just so fierce and so strong that you just didn't think you could achieve those things. It wasn't part of our vision at that time, even though for many of us, certainly we felt we were entitled to it and wanted to be a part of it, and very much thought that it was an injustice that we didn't have that opportunity. But did we actually think we could attain it? I don't think I did it at that time as a young woman. And it created a lot of hostility and anger, and probably made me bolder and stronger at that time. But at the same time, it was something that we knew we were fighting toward, but we didn't think we were going to get there.
Okay. Let's talk about your leadership style and the core values that have come along with that. Associated with you are such things as courage, integrity, tenacity, value about community empowerment, and also risk-taking. Do you want to take one or more of those and give us an example?
Well, I think that leadership, and a very significant part of leadership, is a really strong set of core values. Hopefully that all of our leaders, and as we look to leaders that we will follow and who will lead, that they have a good core set of values. And for me, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that as a young woman, I grew up with and it wasn't a fantasy, it was an idea of what the ideal world should be, that there should be truth and justice and all the kinds of things that you're supposed to believe in. Well, I certainly did believe it, and I felt that was an important part of that responsibility, is to do it honestly, to have the kind of integrity and responsibility that went to it. There was accountability every step of the way. So whatever it was that you were going to do, you were going to fulfill. In other words, you didn't take on a task or responsibility without knowing that you had a duty to get that done. And so that was a very significant, and those kinds of values, I think, are a very important part of it. And you don't realize that you're really doing that until you're just part of that. And you're confronted on a regular basis as a leader to compromise those values. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, it's important to have a very solid set of values as you go in. And for me, that was a very important part of what I was doing. And for me, that played a very valuable role as I continued to exercise the kind of leadership or the skill set that I had at that time. So, I know they're working on my sound. It goes up and down and around. I don't know if I can do anything different. But the other part of it, of course, is is operating with integrity in the duty as a leader. And of course, integrity really is about honesty, and really the honesty has to start with yourself. It isn't about all of those other things out there. You know, you have to have honesty yourself, to yourself. You can't have expectations out there and expect everyone else to be honest or straightforward. You yourself have to be significantly a part of that, and you have to be honest with yourself, because playing a leadership role is something that you need to it isn't like you play it occasionally and you take it on and you will, you know, put it on like a jacket or anything else. It is something that once you step into that role and responsibility, you have to passionately understand and recognize the duty and the responsibility that goes with the leadership role. And so it is it's important that you take that on. I've seen a lot of people who do not understand that part of leadership.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I think that, you know, even now, today, I'm not an elected official, I'm retired, but I still have an unbelievable amount of duty and responsibility to a community and to a group of people to continue to assist them and empower them. So just because I left the elected title behind, that doesn't mean I left my leadership responsibilities behind. So I still have those duties to carry on. I have seen people that have said to myself and others, well, I'm not in that role, so I don't do that anymore. And I just don't think it works that way. I think that once you're a leader in the community and you take on those duties and responsibility, you must own it and be a part of it. So it's important. And I don't want to disparage anyone, but yes, I've seen many people who walk away from those duties and responsibilities and say, I'm not doing that anymore, or, you know, I'm no longer. I think that's the ownership that you take. So in taking on a leadership role, it isn't anything that you can just casually come in and out of. It is a duty that you own up to and that you take on that responsibility, and so it isn't, you know, just because you may not have the title or wear that around, the reality is that if in fact you are playing or you think you're going to be playing a leadership role, recognize and understand the ownership that goes with it. For me, as far as a style, I think that it has been a different kind of styles that I've used in different kinds of circumstances and situations. In certain instances, you have to be very aggressive and very assertive in your style, because people they need to be thumped on the head sometimes for them to get it or to recognize that it is what needs to change or what needs to go on. In other times, you're a negotiator, right? And so you're providing a leadership role and you're negotiating toward a change or toward an outcome. So you're playing that role. In other instances, you're a mentor because you're trying to bring people into that kind of leadership responsibility and duties. You need to mentor them. You need to bring them along and include them. So with that, of course, you're providing motivation and inspiration, hopefully, to get them to have that same kind of shared vision. And in many instances, a lot of folks, they see what they want to do and they say, this is what we need to change and that's where we're going to go. And they're just headed in that direction without recognizing they need to build the skill set about how to get there. So you become a teacher as well. So all of these are part of the roles and responsibilities that we all play as leaders. And so you have to be bold, you have to be strong, but you also have to have the ability to recognize that the people that you are involved in either providing leadership or creating the kind of following, I'm going to say build a following, and the people that you need to help you move forward, you need to recognize and understand what they need as well. So you can't be dictating to them. You have to be a part, and I've always have enjoyed trying to have everyone have a stake in it. So we empower a community, we empower people, and while there's a leadership role, that the duty is to really make sure that they are part, that they have a stake in it as well. Otherwise, I think it's very, very hollow and doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. So as for myself, again, I have had to use very aggressive means, confrontational means, which people might find uncomfortable, but in certain instances you need to be in people's face in order for them to recognize and to understand why it is that you're confronting that issue or being, or why it needs to change. And other times you need to find those ways, to find the negotiating points and what it is that how far can you go, and to measure that. And in other instances is, how do I get this group of people to understand how we're going to get there and how we're going to move there. So you're playing all of these roles at all of these times in these leadership roles. I know that for myself, whether it was, the first time in running for office, some may know the story, some may not. Certainly the men in the community told us absolutely not. And so that was one of the first confrontational kinds of things that happened. We could sit there and say, well, okay, well, call us when you want us to run for office. Well, that wasn't going to work, right? Nobody's going to come and tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, it's your turn now. So we knew we needed to confront it, and so when we confronted it, we also knew there were consequences to that confrontational style. So you have to accept that, the consequences that go with it. But if in fact you're going to confront something and be bold in that direction, you have to take the kind of ownership that goes with it. And so at that time, the men in the community had already had their plan. They knew who was running for that seat. And it wasn't one of the women that we wanted to run for that seat. So we had to confront them. We had to be bold. We had to be strong enough. And we knew there were consequences of that style. But we couldn't find any other way because we had tried to negotiate. I'm not saying we didn't first try to negotiate. We asked. We thought they might include us and say, well, maybe not this time, but when? Instead it was no, And so and the same thing with the women that we were leading at that time. I mean, trying to find a candidate was a hard thing. I mean, I was ready to confront the men in the community and say we need to get a woman elected to the U.S. Congress, but I didn't have a candidate. I couldn't find a woman who was willing to stand up and be bold with the men, which was interesting. I was fighting a battle at that time because we knew it was important, but at the same time, we couldn't find a candidate who was willing to be bold along with us, and that was not discouraging, but it spoke volumes about what we still needed to do to educate our community and what it was going to take. And of course, dealing with the consequences of that decision was something that, for some of us, it doesn't matter, we're just going to do it. For others is, I have a career path, I'm doing these things, I'm not going to take that kind of gamble at that time. So you have to be sensitive and understanding of all of it, but every time you confront a situation where you are going to be providing a leadership role, I think it's very important to hopefully have a leader has to have the kind of insight and ability to be able to read what kind of style is going to be effective and operate in those instances. I know that for myself, it is very important that for we as women, I'd like it not to be, but the reality is that most of it has to start with a very aggressive first stance. But yet at the same time, standing around waiting is just something that's not acceptable to me and to most of us that they're involved in trying to bring about bold change. So we need to step forward and of course recognize the consequences of doing that.
Let's talk about a time when you had to confront a situation where Governor Reagan and Democratic leader Willie Brown wanted to put a prison in your backyard. Give us some examples of how you used these principles to succeed in that situation.
Well, it's interesting, and at that time, and it was the Governor Nation at the time, and Willie Brown. And what happened is I was called into the Speaker's office. I was a member of the legislature at that time, and I got called in. Basically, usually you have a meeting with the Speaker and tells you how are things, and I'm going to appoint you to this committee. But at that time, I was called in, and I was told that the governor and the speaker had spoken, and they had decided they needed to put a state prison in Southern California, and they decided to put it in my district. And so I received the information, but I thought it was kind of an opportunity. Well, thank you, but no thanks. And of course, it wasn't that kind of meeting. It was, you will have a prison in your district. And it was explained to me that it needed to be done, and it went as far as to be very condescending and saying there are so many felons that come from your community, so you'll have family members that will be closer to them. So it was and you know, you're talking about the governor and you're talking about the speaker of the assembly, and if you don't know, in the legislature, it is a very hierarchy of leadership. And I was a freshman member of the assembly, a backbencher, better known, somebody who sat in the back and kind of waited to be called on. And they have such a huge hierarchy in their leadership that I was basically the low man in the totem pole, so consequently they were going to dump in my district. I had unfortunately, the lowest registered district in the state and one of the poorest in the community. And so I walked out of that meeting, and I was a little dumbfounded to figure out, I had just been told that this is going to happen. Now, I'm sitting there, at the time, I told him that it was not acceptable. But I know that it didn't mean anything to him, because, Molina says it's not acceptable, who cares? So they were just going to push it off on me. And it was very discouraging because it really sunk to the root of my hostility, back to that boldness of why I was so angry at the time. Of going back and saying, not only did it take me some very bold and aggressive positions in my community to get to this seat of power, here I am, and I'm in the back of the bus still, and I'm being told by the leadership what's going to happen in my district. Well, that's not what leadership is about. And it was like, how am I going to overcome this? And so of course, the first thing you need to do is, of course, reckon with it, understand what has happened. You can't just, if I could have burst out to the speaker at the time, it would have been foolish on my part, and because I didn't have any idea what I was going in for. So I had to step back and get an idea of what was going on. And I had to speak with other colleagues. At that time, I had various members of the legislature that I had developed, political friendships with, and I spoke to them and told them about it. And it was, they lamented, and they said, well, yeah, that happens, and we do need a prison, and the whole thing went on and on. But at the same time, when I started raising the issues of, wait a minute, would they do this to anyone else? Would just walk you in and just tell you this is what you have to accept, and they agreed that that was probably not the right approach to, so, why don't you go in and negotiate for good stuff for yourself in your district? And I'm going, but no, I'm not going to trade this. And that was interesting, because that's when the values kicked in again. All of a sudden, it wasn't just the hostility and the anger that I had, but I had a whole community that I was representing, and it wasn't about what do I get for it. It was about the community is going to have to be settled with this prison. It's going to be near schools and so on. Anyway, as I learned more about it, I became angry, saddened, and kind of lost for a little while. I must say, any time you confront a situation, there's a lot of people that believe, oh yeah, she knows what she's doing. She just, you got to jump right in there and know. There is a lot of intimidation, fear, and worry about what exactly you're going to do. But I did know, number one, I wasn't going to accept it. I knew, too, there were tremendous consequences in not accepting it, because in not accepting the prison, you were telling the governor and you were telling the speaker, the two most powerful people in your so-called sphere of influence, that you were not going to follow their direction or their lead. And so now you were going to have to confront them, and confronting them was going to be nothing, because they had more power than I did. So you had to recognize what the power was, and so you had to figure out how it is that you were going to be able to deal with this. And so, you tried the negotiation, so you went back in and say, let's negotiate this. Can we do something else? Let's find another way to do it. Well, the speaker would hear none of it, and certainly the governor and his people would hear none of it. And it was really, so you had to use all of your skill set all of a sudden. But the way I had to do it was I had to come back to my community and find a way that we could rise up and say this was unacceptable to us. We had seen unacceptable projects come into our district time to time, and with the community standing up and saying absolutely nothing. And it goes back to probably a terrible tradition of people who are just dumped on all of the time, that you get to a point where it's accepted. And so that was a real problem because we had seen the freeways had cut up, and the state 15 years before had come in and cut up East LA 4 different ways by putting the major intersection downtown and just cutting it all up. Communities were torn apart at that time, and homes were lost and so on, and nobody said anything at that time. There was so much of that going on. So trying to figure out how to inform the community, how to build and educate the community. This was an unwanted project and we had to oppose it, and that I was going to try and build an opposition in the legislature with my group, and then hopefully have some community things, and we used the communication skills, all that we had. But it was a major movement that was started. What happened, of course, is that we were very fortunate in by describing it and talking about it to the community. It did what it did to me initially. It made them angry. And I think that many times that's how you spark a movement as well, is it made them angry that all of a sudden somebody up north was telling them what they were going to have in their backyard, and that there was nothing to it. You were going to have to accept it. And so we organized in the community, we did battle with it, and we just, little by little, I mean, we had marches every weekend. I was telling you that Cesar Chavez came and joined us in our march. We made it a cause in the neighborhood that we were not going to have it, and of course it really upset the governor and it upset the speaker, because they were going to fight me. I had luckily developed partners in the legislature who were able to keep it in committee. I spoke boldly. I brought people from the community. We spoke strongly. We presented a solid case, even though it was stacked against us every step of the way. But again, that is when really leadership really counts, when you have to organize on so many different levels. A very aggressive, bold level, a negotiation level that is still operating all of the time, because people still want to talk to you. Okay, what will it take? Okay, we're going to give jobs to all your community. We're going to do this. We're going to build a green belt around it. You won't even notice it's there. They were always negotiating with us on all of it. You needed to keep that alive, right? Because you don't want to kill off anything, but it's because you need to have that dialogue. And then you needed to continue to build in the community and outside of the community, that this was a totally unfair situation in an urban community. Then we talked about and built a case as to where they already had. We already had county prisons there, county jails. We had a federal prison there, that we needed to make a case as to why it was unjust and unfair. So it was education, information, organizing, all of those kinds of things, getting the media to be a part of it, making it a cause, doing the kind of marches and making noise all the way through to raise our level to the height of the power of the governor and the power of the speaker. And they were going to do it anyway. I mean, keep in mind, they were moving forward. One of the things that, when you talk about the consequences, and that you have to, you have to understand that, you are going to be in a situation where you're going to have to make a sacrifice. I had worked very strongly on some legislation that was really important to me. I had worked on it for 2 years. We had done some study bills. The high school dropout rate was just unbelievably bad, as we see it today. It's improving, but at that time, our high schools in the Latino community and for Chicanos, we were dropping out of high school terribly. We weren't even graduating, and just the thought that the schools were allowing it to happen and there wasn't any ownership from the state in trying to graduate each of our kids to at least a high school education just bothered me tremendously. I was able to, again, that call for leadership and organization at the time, and it was a very set of bills that we put together that were very bold as to how we were going to start addressing the issue and the accountability with school boards and superintendents as far as they were now going to be responsible for graduating high school. It was like they, just so many fall off, that's normal. Well, that we were going to change a whole standard that superintendents and school districts were being held accountable to graduate every single student. We had to turn the tables on it. It was so casual before. So it was a very good set of bills. There were 10 bills altogether. In fact, they were so good that I remember the speaker came to me one day and told me as well, Gloria, these 4 bills we're taking away from you. We're giving them to other members. And I'm going, why? And I was sort of a Pollyanna up there. I got to tell you, I just really didn't realize how power worked at that time. But they gave them to other members because they were such good bills and they didn't have good bills, so you needed to take my bills away and give them to them. Which is what happens as well, but that was okay. As long as they passed, I was interested in them. So one of the things that happened is, of course, trying to get bipartisan support. And it's interesting, high school dropouts are always known as a concept that only happens in minority communities and in poor communities. I was able to put together all of the statistics and information at that time to show all of the members of the legislature their high school dropout rates in their district. And once they saw those numbers, all of a sudden I got everyone to support my legislation. So all of the bills not only passed with bipartisan support, even the moneyed bills in the Assembly, when they went over to the Senate, there were many a senator who was willing to sign on and get the bills, and so they all passed. I was so excited. So one day I get called into the governor's office thinking, oh, here's the day where, we can dress up and they're going to take pictures and there's the pins and the governor is going to sign all of these great bills. And instead, the governor sat at a coffee table and he put a yellow tablet in front of me and he said, Supervisor, or Assemblywoman, which of the bills would you like me to sign? And I said, well, Governor, I'd like you to sign all of the bills. I can give you a whole summary of all of them as to why they're so effective and why they're so good and why it will change as to how we deal with high school graduation rates and so on in the state. And he said, well, I know all about the bills. I just need to know which ones you want me to sign. And I didn't realize I was part of a game at that time, and the governor, and so at the end of the day, he said, I'd be happy to sign them all. You're right, they're good legislation. But I need you to accept a prison in East LA. So that was the trade-off. So it was painful as it was, and that's when values kick in again, and responsibility and duty. Now there is no doubt that I had this larger responsibility, and I knew this legislation, because it had a lot of accountability, was really going to be able to change dramatically the way school districts and superintendents were dealing with high school dropouts. They were no longer going to be a casual thought. They were going to be the duty and the responsibility of a school district to graduate every single child and create a program for them. So they was very, very important. Yet at the same time, I had this other issue. So, you were dealing with which one are you going to do? And I knew that I had organized this entire community. And so when you talk about honesty and integrity and responsibility, it was an issue of, you built this community up. You can't go back and tell them, oh, look, I traded for these other bills. I couldn't possibly do that. And I know that it wasn't acceptable to me at all. So regrettably, I told the governor I would not accept a prison in East LA and left. And of course, he vetoed all my bills. And that was the consequences at that time. And I have to tell you, I went back and, my staff, I had like 3 staff people, but we were very excited because everybody thought I was going in and doing the big pen signing and all of that. And I told them, and I came back, that we lost all of the bills. The governor had vetoed all of them. And it was a really painful thing to share with a group of people who had also worked very hard to get that legislation through at the time. But the point is, those are the consequences that happen and the leadership responsibility that you have. And of course, it was a battle that we continued to fight all the way through. And the governor, by the way, the legislation passed for the prison. I want you to know. It was signed by the governor to cite the prison in East LA. And so we lost, but we didn't. Because that's when you have to recognize it. You may take a loss here and there, And that's another part of leadership responsibility. We had a whole community. We could not accept that as a loss. So we needed to continue our movement. We needed to continue, even though the governor had signed the bill, even though they had set aside the money, they were going to be constructing, they were in the process of buying the land and so on. We had to figure out, and of course at that time I decided to run for the city council in Los Angeles and so on, and we decided to file a lawsuit, and I got the city council to back me up, and we filed a lawsuit against the state about the siting of the prison. We fought the EIR, which was another mechanism, and we organized for that. You know, at the end today, we have no prison in East LA.